This is what I heard, and this is what I saw. My last name is Aten. My paternal grandfather was born in 1907 in Darke County, Ohio, outside a small town named Greenville. His family raised beef cattle and hogs, grew corn and soybeans. My father was the first generation to go to college at Ohio State. I grew up a suburban kid in Cleveland and then Detroit. In walks in my grandfather's pastures or packed in the cab of his well-used Toyota pickup truck scrunched between these two men, I'd ask our family's history. We are descendants of Scots, English, and the name Aten was likely some Dutch derivative name. I vaguely remember them talking how it is also the name of the Egyptian sun god. The power and the mystery in that perplex me. My grandfather Adrian was a man from the greatest generation. At a young age, I sensed it. His thick, leathery hands had plowed the fields with a horse and plow. His stature and gait was rooted firmly in the soil and community of Greenville, Ohio. In these walks and pickup truck rides, they told me about my grandfather's brother Frank, killed in World War II as a U.S. Naval armed guard. Once my grandfather said I look like him. In pictures we have, I see myself. Uncle Frank was killed on July 2nd, 1944, somewhere in the Indian Ocean. He was on a Liberty ship, the SS Jean Nicolet, torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-8. 76 men were killed. 24 survived. First-hand accounts are upon the SS Jean Nicolet being torpedoed by the I-8. The crew escaped to lifeboats. They were captured by the Japanese and taken to the top of the submarine. The prisoners were forced to run a gauntlet and stabbed by bayonets through and at the end of the gauntlet. Some were tied to the submarines as it went back under. There are multiple reports of sharks in the water. This is how Uncle Frank died. We don't know if he knew my grandmother was pregnant with my father at the time, if he had received that letter. My father said my great-grandmother Clara never got over the loss. I have distant memories of her. She was hard, serious, a stoic quietness in her old age which I knew as unknown history. I have vivid memories of my grandfather's hands and his gaze as he looked across the cow pastures and cornfields. My father and I think of Frank and Adrian as young boys riding their horses around with the other Greenville farm boys. We chuckle to think of them riding around on ponies, smoking cigarettes. My daughter was born in October 2002, 1 year after the September 11th attacks and in the ramp-up to the Second Iraq War. In the joy and anxiety of her birth, the outer body experience and spiritual revelation a father feels at childbirth, I was taken aback by a thought that popped out of nowhere. Why is there war? There's a cosmic and ancient connection when one looks into the child's eyes for the first time, and having felt that, this question came up. My daughter's grandmother, my wife's mother, was Japanese, Kazuko. She was part of a Yakuza family considered to be the Japanese mob. In the late 1950s, my father-in-law, from a Biloxi, Mississippi shrimping family, was stationed in Tokyo as a part of the U.S. Army. Family legend has it my father-in-law had to fight the Yakuza boys to marry Kazuko. Kazuko was boisterous, enigmatic, tough, traditional. She came to the United States with her husband in the 1960s in Alabama. She was treated harshly in those days, sometimes even by the family she married into. Some relatives have Confederate flag tattoos. Kazuko passed away in 2005, shortly after her home was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina in Biloxi. She had cancer and died from complications removing a tumor. Her body could not eliminate water. There's a lot in Kazuko's story that is secret, mysterious, and perplexing. My wife and her sisters still try and come to terms with it. Japan was completely isolated for 200 years until the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. Nobody, no foreigners were allowed in. Seeing the rise of the United States, Europe, and its place with China, Japan quickly modernized by centralizing power with the emperor and dissolving the shogunate. Feudal society came to an end. The imperial oath of 5 articles, written in March of 1868, provided the backdrop to the rise of the Japanese military power, which came to a head with the other rising world powers in modernity. Uncle Frank was a casualty in this in July of 1944. Kazuko's youth was spent in post-atomic bomb Japan, governed by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. It was in this environment that Japan formed a unique identity that carries to this day. Japan has its rich history and culture, along with being the only country to experience massive nuclear attack and fallout. The military was disbanded. This post-World War II Japan environment created a space for new ideas and beliefs to blossom, some rooted in its Buddhist past, as it no longer had militaristic and Shinto oversight. I don't know the full story, but sometime in the late 1950s, Kazuko attended a study meeting where a teacher and educator named Jose Toda lectured on Buddhism, focused on a core teaching called the Lotus Sutra. Chanting the sutra's title translates to devotion to the mystic law of cause and effect through sound. Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Some 50 years later, Kazuko would tell me about this mantra. I began to study its teaching and the history of Jose Toda. Before the war, he was part of an educational and Buddhist lay organization called the Soka Gakkai, and during the war, for his refusal to mix elements of Shinto with Buddhism, he was imprisoned. His teacher and mentor, Sune Saburo Makaguchi, died in jail. Toda emerged from jail with a vision and conviction to erase the word misery from the planet and for all life to be treasured. This is done by one awakening to their Buddha nature, one person at a time. Toda's protege and disciple, Daisaku Ikeda, took this philosophy to the world. Through his nourishment, Kazuko and her friends opened up Nam-myoho Renge Kyo in my life in the city of Detroit 17 years ago. Detroit, once known as the arsenal of democracy, built the bombs and airplanes that decimated Japan. History has so much irony and lessons in the city of Tokyo and Detroit, comparing each of them in 1940 and to today in 2019. In convoluted and mysterious ways of cause and effect, my life, my being, was created in the circumstance of Uncle Frank and my mother-in-law Kazuko. We are the outcomes of war and peacetime in previous generations, layered with the history book names like General MacArthur, President Truman, Emperor Hirohito, and the Egyptian sun god Aten. And we go on, reflecting on our dark and confusing pasts, the imperfections and mistakes of our ancestors, the same imperfections and mistakes we make in our own lives, and realize there are times of stillness and absolute understanding alone and with family and friends and their unknown histories. This is what I heard.